They told you this story was about savages, about wild men who struck without reason, who tore through English flesh with unholy fury. That's the version Europe wanted you to believe, but I'm going to tell you the version they buried, the one they prayed you'd never uncover, because the massacre of the Boyd was not madness. It was method. It was justice carved into bone and blood, a ritual of vengeance older than every empire that later claimed moral superiority. In December of 1809, in the turquoise waters of Whangaroa Bay, 65 Europeans were slaughtered, some beaten, some burned, and yes, many eaten. But if you think this was barbarity, you've already fallen for the trick. You've already been conditioned to see one people as savage and another as civilized. Tonight, I'm going to break that illusion. I'm going to drag you through the flames of humiliation, through the cold machinery of colonial arrogance, and into a world where revenge wasn't chaos, it was law. And once you hear it, you'll understand why history has been rewritten, why you were only ever told half the story, and why men who thought themselves untouchable ended up devoured in the shadows of a world they never truly understood. The HMS Boyd sailed with the arrogance of empire, coal in its hold, cedar stacked on its decks, passengers dreaming of new worlds and fortunes. But aboard was a boy, 16 years old, whose back would become a battlefield, whose flesh would be turned into scripture. His name was Te Ara, son of a chief, heir to Mana, the sacred prestige of his people. To the Europeans he was just another native. To his people he was bloodline, honor, the living embodiment of centuries. When Captain John Thompson ordered this boy tied like an animal, starved and whipped before the jeering eyes of strangers, he was not just punishing a sailor, he was desecrating an entire cosmos. That lash-d, I'd not strike Te Ara alone. It struck ancestors, gods, and the sacred law of Utu, balance restored by blood. Thompson thought he had broken a boy. What he did was awaken a force older and more merciless than any British warship. And in that moment, the fate of every man, woman, and child aboard the Boyd was sealed. Imagine standing on that deck, the sun beating down, the salt air biting your skin, while a boy, barely 16, is bound to the iron capstan like an animal for slaughter. His wrists bleeding into the wood, his lips cracked from thirst, his back a canvas for a whip that tore flesh into ribbons. The crew stood and watched. Some turned away in discomfort, but none dared intervene. Captain Thompson's eyes were cold, disciplined, shaped by the Napoleonic Wars. To him, punishment was not about guilt or innocence. It was about dominance, order, fear. He didn't need truth. He needed obedience. And so, for 3 days, Te Ara was displayed like a crucifixion, a warning to every soul aboard. This is what happens when you challenge empire. But Thompson could not comprehend what he had really done. In his European world, power was measured in coin and steel. In Te Ara's world, power was measured in honor, mana, and when mana was violated, the law of Utu demanded balance. Not as a choice, not as a whim, but as a sacred obligation. When Te Ara's blood hit that deck, a debt was written in fire, and it was a debt that could only be repaid with blood greater still. The boy's silence was more terrifying than screams. He endured each lash without a cry, his gaze fixed on the horizon of his homeland. That was not submission, it was calculation. While the Europeans thought they were breaking him, he was memorizing every detail of the ship's routines, guard shifts, weaknesses, escape routes. He was transforming his agony into a blueprint of destruction, and when they finally cut him when his shredded back oozed with infection, Te Ara bowed his head in false humility. Thompson believed he had won. He had no idea that every act of submission was a mask, every nod of obedience a weapon being sharpened. At night, while the crew slept, Te Ara reopened his wounds, ensuring they would remain raw, fresh, undeniable, because he knew, when he stepped back into his homeland, those scars would speak louder than any words. They would ignite warriors, summon ancestors, and command vengeance. What Thompson dismissed as a flogged boy was in truth a messenger, one carrying the most dangerous thing in the world, humiliation that demanded balance. And when the Boyd's sails finally caught the winds toward Whangaroa Bay, the crew believed they were sailing toward profit. They were sailing into a trap centuries in the making. The Boyd cut through Pacific waters, her sails full, her crew unaware that doom already stalked them. In the captain's cabin, Thompson boasted of discipline, convinced he had tamed a rebellious native into useful obedience. He spoke of timber profits, of London's markets, of the fortune awaiting him for masts carved from ancient New Zealand forests. His men nodded, pretending confidence, but many had seen the boy's back torn open, and something in his eyes unsettled them. It was not the gaze of the broken, it was the gaze of someone waiting. Te Ara moved among them like a shadow. He carried water, scrubbed decks, followed orders without protest. Yet every step, every glance was a calculated act. He was mapping his enemy, learning their weaknesses. One sailor drank too much rum. Another slept heavily through his watch. The cook's hands trembled with guilt for the lie that had condemned him. Te Ara saw it all, catalogued it, stored it. Revenge was not rage, it was mathematics, and he was assembling an equation that would end with the Boyd in ashes. But his strategy reached beyond the ship. He understood that one boy could not kill 65 Alpil. He needed warriors, he needed the tribe, so he prepared his evidence. By night he reopened his wounds, tearing scabs so blood soaked his clothing. He rehearsed his words, shaping them not as a plea but as a war speech. He would not say, "They hurt me." He would say, "They dishonored us all." For in his culture, humiliation was collective. An insult to one chief's son was an insult to ancestors, to gods, to the entire people. The Boyd's crew did not realize that every welt on his body was no longer his. It belonged to his tribe now, and their law required balance. When land appeared on the horizon, green hills rising above turquoise water, Te Ara's chest swelled not with relief, but with fire. Whangaroa Bay, his home, his people, his stage. To Thompson it was paradise, forests untouched, timber ripe for plunder. To Te Ara it was a theater of revenge. He dove into the waters, each stroke carrying him closer to vengeance, closer to the council fires that would decide the fate of every man aboard the Boyd. The ship's crew watched the boy swim ashore and vanish into trees. Some were relieved, perhaps he'd desert and rid them of a burden. But in truth, they had just witnessed the opening act of their annihilation. The village gathered in silence when Te Ara emerged from the forest. His body told the story before his mouth opened. Torn cloth clung to his frame, soaked with blood that still dripped from raw lacerations. The marks of the cat o' nine tails glistened in the firelight, ridges carved into his skin like grotesque writing. No words were needed. Every man, woman, and elder understood the weight of what they saw. A chief's son had been bound, whipped, humiliated before foreigners. In their world, this was not injury, this was desecration. They formed the sacred circle around the fire. The boy stepped into its center, stripped to the waist, wounds visible to every eye. And his father, the great chief Tipuhi, sat among the elders, face hard as stone, his silence heavier than any shout. And then Te Ara spoke, not as a victim but as a warrior returned from exile. His voice did not tremble. He described how he was falsely accused, bound like livestock, displayed in chains before strangers who laughed, spat, and watched. He told of the whip, each lash ripping flesh, each strike witnessed by men who thought themselves masters of the seas, and he ended with the truth that struck the council's heart like a spear. When they humiliated me, they humiliated you all. The silence broke. Warriors pounded the earth with clubs. Elders whispered the sacred law. Mana had been polluted, balance had been shattered, and only Utu could restore it. Utu was not vengeance in the European sense of revenge born from rage. Utu was cosmic correction, a sacred balancing of scales. It required repayment proportionate to the wound, and the wound here was enormous. A chief's son scourged, ancestors mocked, a people dishonored before foreign eyes. The debt was blood and nothing less. Tipuhi rose, His eyes reflected the fire. His words were brief but final. "The Boyd will pay." With that, the council transformed into a war council. Spears and war clubs were sharpened, nets prepared. The elders calculated every step not as chaos, but as ceremony. To them, this was not just battle. This was ritual restoration, a sacred cleansing of dishonor through blood. In that moment, the Boyd's fate was sealed. It would not leave Whangaroa Bay. Its crew would not return to London's markets. What had begun as a flogging of one boy had awakened a storm rooted in centuries of warrior tradition. And when it broke, it would not be random violence. It would be an execution scripted by sacred law. For 3 nights, the council fires burned, and with them, the plan took shape. The warriors of Whangaroa Bay did not speak in frenzy, they spoke in precision. To the Europeans, they would appear welcoming, eager for trade, submissive, but beneath every smile lay sharpened obsidian and hardened resolve. They knew the greed of white men was their greatest weapon, and they would use it like bait on a hook. Te Ara, still raw with wounds, played his role perfectly. He told Captain Thompson that Whangaroa Bay held forests unmatched anywhere in New Zealand. Ancient kauri trees, their timber tall and flawless, worth a fortune in London. Thompson, blinded by profit, seized on the promise without hesitation. He ordered the Boyd's course set north, eager to be the first to plunder the untouched groves. He had no suspicion that Te Ara's story was not a gift, but a trap. On shore, the warriors prepared in silence. Spears were honed until they gleamed like mirrors of death. Clubs were polished, their edges sharper than steel. Young fighters drilled under veterans, repeating movements until they became instinct. The ambush was not merely military, it was ceremonial. Songs of ancestors were sung, invoking spirits of warriors long dead. Every preparation was sacred, every stroke of the whetstone an offering to gods who demanded balance. The plan was devastatingly simple. First, they would lure the captain and his officers ashore, cutting off the head of the serpent. Then confusion would spread among the crew, and finally, the full assault. Canoes swarming the Boyd under cover of deception, warriors boarding in waves until not a single soul remained alive. It would be thorough. It would be final. And it would send a message to every ship that dared enter their waters, that Utu is not optional, and humiliation comes at a cost no empire can bear. Back on the Boyd, the crew muttered uneasily about the boy's sudden loyalty. Some sensed a change in his gaze, a patience too measured for someone once so defiant. But Thompson dismissed all doubts. In his mind, he had broken Te Ara, transformed rebellion into obedience. He failed to see the deeper truth, that every nod, even every careful movement was not surrender, it was theater, and the curtain was about to rise. The turquoise waters of Whangaroa glistened in the morning sun as canoes approached the Boyd. Warriors waved, smiling as though they came to trade. The captain smiled back, utterly blind to the blood-soaked stage he had just stepped onto. The Boyd dropped anchor in Whangaroa Bay, its sails folding in silence like the wings of a great bird settling to rest. The shoreline looked calm, almost inviting. Dense forests whispered with wind, canoes drifted lazily, and smoke curled from the thatched roofs of nearby settlements. For Captain Thompson, it was everything Te Ara had promised. A land brimming with timber, ripe for his taking. But to the Maori watching from the shadows, the ship was no vessel of trade. It was a coffin, floating upright, waiting to be sealed shut. Canoes approached with friendly gestures, warriors offering baskets of fish and fruits. Smiles were exchanged, gifts passed, laughter feigned. Te Ara translated every word, assuring Thompson that the people were eager for peace, eager to prove their loyalty. And the captain, his pride swollen by the belief he had bent the boy's spirit, accepted every gesture as genuine. He wanted the timber, but more than that, he wanted to believe he had mastered these savages. The next morning, the first act of the trap was set. Te Ara invited Thompson ashore, promising to lead him to the towering kauri groves. Thompson agreed without hesitation, bringing with him his first officer, his surgeon, and a handful of armed sailors. They carried muskets, but their guard was low, dulled by the warmth of false friendship. As they walked inland, warriors appeared around them, guiding the path, pointing toward invisible treasures hidden in the trees. But as the forest thickened, the tone shifted, voices quieted, the path narrowed, and suddenly the Europeans realized they were surrounded. Warriors pressed closer, their movements sharp, no longer playful. Then came the signal, a sharp cry that split the air. Spears shot forward like lightning. Clubs rose and fell with sickening thuds. Muskets barely lifted before being torn from trembling hands. Captain Thompson tried to shout, but his words were drowned in blood. His skull shattered under the blow of a taiaha, his body collapsing into the dirt. The surgeon fell screaming, silenced by a spear through his chest. Sailors attempted to flee, but nets ensnared them, dragging them down like fish. Within minutes, the officers were dead. Their bodies lay sprawled in the undergrowth, throats cut, faces unrecognizable. The forest had swallowed them whole, as if the earth itself demanded their silence. The warriors moved swiftly, stripping weapons, gathering trophies, and leaving nothing alive. Only Te'ara remained untouched, his gaze cold and steady as he looked upon the fallen captain. Far offshore, the Boyd floated serenely, its crew unaware that their leader's blood was soaking into sacred soil. The serpent's head had been severed, and soon its body would writhe helplessly, waiting for the final blow. The canoes glided back across the bay as if nothing had changed. Warriors paddled in unison, their faces calm, their voices carrying songs of welcome over the water. But in their wake, the jungle still held the corpses of Captain Thompson and his men, their blood seeping into the roots of Corey trees they would never claim. To the Europeans aboard the Boyd, the returning canoes looked harmless, even cheerful. They believed the captain was simply delayed, still bartering with chiefs for timber rights. They had no idea the heart of their command lay cold and broken beneath the forest canopy. Te'ara climbed aboard with flawless composure. His wounds still marked his back, but his eyes burned with a different fire now. He told the crew that Thompson had gone deep, inland to inspect the timber, and that more men were needed to carry trade goods and muskets. The deception was effortless. The sailors, eager to prove useful and trusting of their captain's authority, even in absence, agreed. More men lowered themselves into canoes, disappearing toward the very same path where their comrades had met the club and spear. None would return. The trap unfolded like clockwork. Each time canoes ferried men ashore, laughter and greetings masked the truth. Warriors embraced them, then swiftly cut them down, their bodies hidden beneath ferns and stones. By evening, the Boyd's strength had thinned to a vulnerable handful. Those left on board were restless, confused, but still clinging to hope that their captain would return at dawn with a deal struck and riches secured. But the Maori had no intention of waiting. That night, fires burned bright along the shore. From the Boyd's deck, the sailors watched the flames, imagining feasts and celebrations of trade. They did not know those fires were signals, each blaze a message passed from tribe to tribe. The cleansing had begun, and the Boyd would not see another sunrise. In the darkness, canoes gathered silently, shadows upon the tide. Warriors painted their faces in red ochre and black ash, the colors of war and death. Weapons gleamed in the firelight, their edges anointed with ritual chants. Every man knew his place, every stroke of the paddle rehearsed in the rhythm of vengeance. The Europeans believed they were safe, drifting at anchor. In truth, they were surrounded by an army cloaked in silence, preparing to strike with the force of ancestral wrath. The Boyd slept uneasily that night, rocked gently by the tide, while death crept closer with every paddle stroke. The hour was deep, when even the gulls had fallen silent, and the sea itself seemed to hold its breath. The Boyd drifted at anchor, its lanterns swaying dimly, the last of its crew drowsing on deck or curled in hammocks below. The silence was their undoing. They did not hear the first paddles cutting the black water. They did not see the shadows gathering, canoes gliding like phantoms across the bay. Only the moon caught the gleam of weapons, the painted faces of warriors, eyes fixed on vengeance. The first to climb aboard were silent as death, their feet ghosting across the wooden planks. Knives cut the throats of sleeping men before a single cry could escape. But silence cannot last in slaughter. Soon the deck thundered with the clash of steel, the roar of voices, the scream of men waking too late to understand they were already dead. Muskets fired in panic, their smoke rising uselessly into the night, but the shots were wild, wasted in chaos. Spears drove into bodies, clubs shattered skulls, and nets pulled down men who tried to flee into the water. Below deck, the air became a trap. Sailors scrambled in darkness, shouting orders with no captain to answer, no officers to lead. Lanterns overturned, shadows leaping against the walls. Warriors poured down the hatches, their chants echoing like war drums in the cramped wooden belly. The Europeans fought, but every corridor narrowed their movement. Every corner became a tomb. The air filled with blood and smoke and the sound of bones breaking. On deck, the massacre grew relentless. The last officers, pale with terror, tried to rally their men, but fear had already hollowed the crew. Some dropped their muskets and begged. Others leapt into the sea where waiting canoes split their skulls before the tide could claim them. By dawn, the Boyd was no longer a ship, but a floating altar of Utu. The survivors were few, dragged up in chains, spared not from mercy but from ritual. Women and children were pulled screaming from their hiding places, their fate delayed only because the elders demanded it. The warriors stood blood-soaked, weapons dripping, chanting to the rising sun. Smoke drifted over the deck, mingling with the cries of captives. The Boyd had been taken. The serpent's body was cut open, its guts spilled into the bay. Yet the storm was not finished. The greatest act of retribution, the final cleansing fire, was still to come. The sun rose blood-red over Whangaroa Bay, its light glinting on waters that carried more than reflections. Bodies drifted in silence, faces pale against the tide. The Boyd stood motionless, her decks soaked in crimson, her masts towering like crosses over a floating graveyard. The survivors, bound and trembling, were dragged ashore. There they faced the circle of elders, the sacred tribunal of a people who measured justice not in mercy, but in balance. The women and children of the Boyd clutched one another, their eyes wild with terror. The sailors, their hands tied behind their backs, staggered beneath blows from spears and clubs, driven into the center of the marae. Every villager gathered to watch. To them this was not slaughter, it was judgment. The crime had been great. The humiliation of a chief's son, the desecration of Mana, the arrogance of men who thought chains and whips could erase dignity. And so the sentence was not debated. It had already been carved into the bones of their tradition. Utu. Te Ara stepped forward, stripped to the waist, his back still bearing the scars of the flogging. He stood before the captives not as a victim, but as executioner, the living embodiment of the tribe's grievance. In silence he raised a club. The first blow fell swift and final. A sailor crumpled to the earth, skull split like dry wood. The crowd erupted in chants, their voices rolling like thunder over the bay. One by one, more were struck down. Spears pierced chests, knives cut throats, clubs broke bones. The captives screamed, but their cries were swallowed by the songs of war, by the rhythm of drums that marked each death as sacred payment. Blood ran into the sand, darkening the earth that had called for retribution. But the Boyd herself had not yet been judged. The ship, too, had carried Mana, its timbers scarred with violence, its decks soaked in dishonor. To leave it floating was to leave the wound open. And so, as the last of the sailors fell, warriors rowed back aboard with burning brands. The ship's belly was filled with fire, flames licked the sails, climbed the rigging, and consumed the decks. The Boyd roared as her masts cracked and fell, a funeral pyre upon the sea. Smoke billowed into the sky, black and endless, a signal to every horizon. Balance had been restored. For the people of Whangaroa, it was not murder, it was not massacre, it was cleansing. But to the Europeans who would later hear the story, it was something else entirely, a nightmare, a warning, and a mark of terror that would stain maps and memory for generations. When the flames finally died, the wreck of the Boyd smoldered in the bay, its charred ribs jutting from the water like the bones of some ancient leviathan. For days, smoke lingered in the sky, a grim banner declaring that Utu had been delivered. The people of Whangaroa returned to their routines, the blood washed from their hands but not from their memory. In their eyes, balance had been restored. Yet they knew balance is never permanent. The sea carries more than trade, it carries news. And news spreads like fire. A month later, a whaling ship entered Whangaroa waters. Its crew saw the wreckage, smelled the rot, and pieced together fragments of horror from scattered remains. Survivors whispered their tale, though most who had been spared were children, too young to fully understand what had unfolded. The sailors fled, carrying the story south, then across oceans until it reached Sydney, then London. And with every telling, the story changed. To the Maori, it had been justice. To the Europeans, it became treachery, savagery, proof of barbarism lurking beneath smiles. The press in Sydney inked the words in bold, Massacre at Whangaroa. They wrote of innocents butchered, of women and children slain without mercy. They did not mention te ara's flogging. They did not print the word utu. They did not speak of humiliation or balance or a chief's mana desecrated under the lash. To them, it was a simple tale of civilization betrayed by savages. Colonial officials seethed. Missionaries recoiled in horror. Merchants demanded revenge, not for the sailors, but for the message the massacre sent, that a British ship could be humbled, burned, its men slaughtered by those they deemed beneath them. It was not just about the Boyd. It was about the illusion of control. And illusions, once shattered, demand blood to mend. Retaliation was swift. Armed vessels sailed north. Villages suspected of involvement were attacked. Muskets fired into huts, flames consumed canoes, and bodies fell into the surf. The colonists called it justice. The Maori called it hypocrisy. One atrocity answered another, and the spiral deepened. The Boyd's ashes had not cooled before new fires lit the horizon. And so the cycle of revenge spun on, each side convinced of its own righteousness, each blind to the mirror they held to one another. What began with a flogging on foreign planks had become a war of worlds, a clash of traditions where neither side could see the other except through smoke and blood. The story of the Boyd did not stay in Whangaroa, nor even in the colonies of the South Pacific. It grew larger, darker, and more grotesque with every retelling, until it no longer resembled the events that had birthed it. In London, in Sydney, in the taverns of whalers and the salons of empire, the massacre became legend, one shaped not by Maori voices, but by European fear and imagination. Pamphlets circulated describing the savage feast of the cannibals, claiming that the crew had been roasted and eaten in full ceremony. Engravings were printed showing Maori warriors gnawing on limbs, dancing around cauldrons of boiling flesh. None of these witnesses had been there. None had seen what actually transpired, but the image was too powerful, too useful to resist. It painted a portrait of New Zealand not as a land of potential trade, but as a den of monsters. And monsters, once created, justified conquest. Missionaries seized on the tale, spinning sermons about heathen darkness, about a people lost in sin and violence, awaiting salvation through the cross. Merchants used it as leverage to demand greater protection for their ventures, pushing governors toward military intervention. Politicians whispered that if Britain did not subdue these islands, some other empire, France perhaps, would seize the chance. And so the Boyd became more than a ship, it became a weapon of narrative. Back in Whangaroa, the elders heard whispers of these rumors. Some even laughed, mocking the absurdity of feasts that had never taken place, but others grew wary. They knew stories were as dangerous as muskets. A lie told often enough could summon ships with cannons, soldiers with flags, and settlers with hunger for land. What they saw as balance, the Europeans saw as barbarism, and perception, once warped, rarely bends back. Te Ara himself became a ghost in the stories. In some accounts he was a villain, a traitor leading his captain to slaughter. In others he was erased entirely. The flogging forgotten, the chain marks on his back vanishing from history. What mattered was not his truth, but the Empire's need for myth. The Boyd lay silent beneath the bay, her bones picked clean by salt and tide. But in the imaginations of Europe, she still burned, still screamed, still fed the flames of conquest. The massacre had ended in blood, but its afterlife would last for generations, each retelling further distorting the truth, each distortion tightening the grip of empire on a land that had only sought to defend its honor. The Boyd's ashes had cooled-eyed and Whangaroa Bay, but the embers of its story glowed far beyond the horizon. In colonial offices, in pulpits, in shipping houses, the massacre was not remembered as a single moment of vengeance. It was treated as prophecy. To many, it revealed the true nature of the Maori, dangerous, bloodthirsty, incapable of coexistence unless tamed. This perception did not remain confined to whispers. It hardened into policy, into sermons, into the very blueprint of colonization. Missionaries were the first to seize the Boyd's shadow as a tool. They framed it as proof of why their civilizing mission was urgent. In their journals they wrote of souls drowning in darkness, of a land cursed by savagery, of people who must be saved by Christ's light or crushed by Britain's iron. The massacre gave them leverage to enter Maori communities with greater zeal, armed not only with Bibles but with the Empire's backing. Where scripture failed, muskets followed. Merchants too sharpened the tale to suit their hunger. They warned investors that trade in New Zealand was too dangerous unless Britain secured dominance. The Boyd's ghost stalked their letters, invoked to justify naval patrols, fortified harbours and treaties that would strip mana from chiefs under the guise of protection. It was no longer about timber or whaling, it was about ensuring no British subject would ever again be humbled before a people they considered lesser. Yet among the Maori, the Boyd did not vanish into silence. Elders retold the story not as shame, but as warning. Children were taught that utu must always be paid, but also that the pakeha could not be trusted to understand balance. To them, the Boyd was a reminder of their ancestors' courage, but also of the terrible cost when two worlds clashed without understanding. It became both pride and burden, a memory sung in chants, carried in bones, echoing across generations. In London, the story entered books and lectures, each retelling bending further from truth. Some spoke of cannibal orgies, others of barbaric rituals, none spoke of Te Ara's hum. Iliation under the whip, the insult to mana, the sacred law of utu. That silence was deliberate. To admit the cause was to admit complicity, and empires cannot build themselves on admissions of guilt. Thus, the Boyd became more than a massacre. It became a tool of empire, a story molded into a weapon that would shape policy, justify conquest, and haunt every future negotiation between Maori and the Crown. The ship may have burned, but its shadow stretched longer than any mast, across oceans, across generations, into the very foundations of New Zealand's colonial wars. The Boyd's charred bones lay at the bottom of Whangaroa Bay, but its echo rose in London's halls and Sydney's taverns like a funeral bell that never stopped ringing. Fear was a currency, and the massacre gave Britain a mint that would never run dry. Politicians whispered of it when debating whether New Zealand should be more tightly bound to imperial law. Admirals invoked it when demanding more ships for Pacific patrols. Missionaries cited it when begging for funds to save heathen souls. And so the massacre grew larger than life, no longer a single act of utu, but a permanent stain branded onto the empire's imagination. Fear of the Maori became policy. Traders who once treated the tribes as equals now approached with suspicion, pistols tucked under coats, contracts rewritten with clauses that favored British control. Every treaty negotiation from that moment on carried the ghost of the Boyd. The chiefs sitting across from colonial officials knew it. They felt the gaze, the unspoken accusation, "Your people are the ones who ate our sailors." It didn't matter if those chiefs had never set foot in Whangaroa. Guilt was collective, suspicion hereditary. But here lies the darker truth. Britain did not merely recoil in horror at the Boyd, they adapted. The empire has always known how to turn fear into leverage. The Massacre was spun as evidence that New Zealand required Britain's guiding hand, that without empire, the islands would drown in chaos and violence. What had begun as utu for a son's humiliation became justification for domination. Meanwhile, in Maori oral histories, the story was kept with nuance. Elders spoke of Te Ara's torment, the lash that stripped not just his skin, but his mana. They remembered the careful planning, the ancestral duty fulfilled, but they also remembered the fallout, the reprisals, the mistrust, the way outsiders twisted the story until it bore no resemblance to the truth. Among tribes, the Boyd became both triumph and warning. Yes, our people defended honor, but see how the Pakeha turned that defense into a weapon against us. It is here the dissent deepens, because the Boyd did not end with burning timbers or butchered bodies. It seeded a narrative that would fuel the New Zealand Wars decades later. British settlers arrived not as neighbours but as occupiers, fortified by a tale of cannibals that demanded preemptive control. Every musket fired in those later wars, every acre seized, every treaty broken, each carried a trace of the Boyd's blood. And here is what you must understand. The massacre was not only an event, it was the perfect alibi for empire. A single ship, 65 lives, and a ritual of vengeance became the script for subjugating an entire people. That is how the game is played. Fear weaponized, memory distorted, blood transformed into empire's ink. By the 1820s, the Boyd Massacre was no longer just a story whispered in ports. It had become a tool sharpened into doctrine. Missionaries carried it in their sermons, merchants carried it in their contracts, and colonial governors carried it in their policies. The event had been mythologized into something greater than fact, and that was precisely what made it useful. The empire thrives not on truth but on carefully crafted fear. Missionaries were among the first to wield the tale with precision. When they stood before congregations in London or Edinburgh, their words dripped with urgency. They spoke of a land of cannibals, of innocent Europeans devoured by savages who knew no God. They pointed to the Boyd as proof that without Christ's intervention, the Maori were doomed to barbarity, and that Britain had a divine obligation to intervene. Each sermon stirred coins into collection plates. Each retelling made the path into New Zealand smoother for the men who followed, not just preachers, but surveyors, naval officers, and spies. For while missionaries appeared to carry only Bibles, many were also instruments of empire. Behind their calls for conversion lay another mission, information gathering. The massacre had shown Britain how volatile these islands could be, and the Crown knew that commerce and conquest required intelligence. Missionaries became ideal informants, positioned inside Maori communities, writing long letters home not only about souls but about land, resources, and tribal politics. They watched, they mapped, they translated, and they reported, all under the halo of Christian charity. And here the Boyd Massacre was their constant weapon. Whenever chiefs questioned their presence, whenever tribes resisted the push of this new faith, missionaries evoked the story. They reminded both their converts and their patrons that violence was the natural state of the Maori, that without Britain, blood would rule forever. It was manipulation hidden under scripture, empire disguised as salvation. The Maori, however, saw through fragments of this theatre. Some chiefs welcomed missionaries as useful intermediaries. Others tolerated them as long as they respected tapu and tribal law. But the seed of distrust had been planted. The Boyd was the shadow in every negotiation, the silent accusation in every meeting. The story was never told as it happened. The lash that tore Te Ara's back, the arrogance of Captain Tompi, son, the sacred law of Utu, those details vanished in British retellings. All that remained was the spectacle of cannibal vengeance, and that is how suppression works. Not by erasing memory, but by reshaping it into something profitable. A single event distorted into a myth wielded as a tool that builds empire. You are beginning to see the pattern, aren't you? Violence is never just violence, it is always currency, always leverage, always fuel for something larger. The Boyd was ash long before Britain raised its flag over New Zealand, but the massacre never died. It lived on in print, in rumour, in the very ink of propaganda. By the 1830s, when Britain debated whether to annex these islands, the story of Whangaroa Bay resurfaced like a corpse dragged from the deep. It was summoned in parliamentary speeches, in naval reports, in missionary appeals. Every mention dripped with the same refrain. The Maori are violent, the Maori are dangerous, the Maori need us. This is how empire works. It never arrives as conquest at first, it arrives as guardianship. Britain painted itself not as the aggressor, but as the reluctant parent forced to intervene for the good of its wayward child. The Boyd Massacre became Exhibit A in this theatre of necessity. Lawmakers argued that if Britain did not act, more ships would burn, more lives would be devoured, and chaos would choke the Pacific trade routes. The lie was elegant. Britain was not seizing land, it was preventing another Boyd. But beneath this polished rhetoric was something darker. The Boyd had become the perfect origin myth for domination. It stripped the Maori of agency, reducing them to caricatures of blood and fire. It erased the cause, the lash, the humiliation, the sacred demand for utu, and left only the spectacle of cannibalism. By controlling the narrative, Britain controlled perception. And perception, more than muskets or treaties, is the foundation of empire. The Maori, however, told another story in their marae. There, by firelight, Elder Ez reminded their people of what truly happened. A chief's son bound like an animal, whipped before strangers, his mana violated beyond repair. They remembered the planning, the duty, the sacred restoration of balance, and they warned their children that the Pakeha's greatest weapon was not the musket, but the lie. For while the Boyd had been utu in its truest form, the retelling became a curse that poisoned every future meeting with outsiders. So the empire advanced, armed with paper and memory as much as steel. The Boyd was whispered in the same breath as the Black Hole of Calcutta, another colonial wound reshaped into justification for British expansion. These stories became scripture in the halls of power, parables of savagery that demanded empire's touch. The reality of Thompson's arrogance, of Ta'ara's suffering, of Utu's sacred law was scrubbed away. What remained was empire's truth, a version of history designed to sanctify conquest. And this is the descent you were never meant to see. The Boyd was not just a massacre, it was a mask, and behind it stood the machinery of colonization, turning blood into myth, myth into mandate, mandate into empire. Once you recognize this pattern, you can never unsee it. By the mid-1830s, the Boyd Massacre had become less a memory and more a weapon sharpened for psychological war. British officials, merchants, and missionaries wielded it not only in their own halls, but within Maori communities themselves. The story was repeated to chiefs as a warning, a reminder of how quickly Europeans would retaliate, of how long their grudges could endure. It was whispered that Britain never forgot, that the blood of the Boyd crew still cried out for vengeance. The message was clear: resist, and your tribe may suffer the same fate. This was not conquest by cannon, but conquest by fear. The Boyd's legend fractured Maori unity, turning their own traditions against them. Utu, once a sacred law that bound the tribes in balance, was reimagined by outsiders as barbarity, a stain that justified control. And as this foreign interpretation seeped into negotiations, some chiefs found themselves questioning the weight of their own customs. If every act of Utu would be twisted into savagery, if every defense of mana would be paraded in London as proof of cannibal chaos, then how could they resist without feeding the very propaganda used against them? Division crept in. Some iwi sought closer ties with missionaries, hoping Christianity might shield them from the shadow of the Boyd. Others armed themselves with muskets, preparing for the inevitable clash. Still others tried to walk the line between, leveraging relationships with traders while maintaining ancestral law. But the more fractured the Maori became, the stronger the empire's position grew. Unity had always been the tribe's greatest strength, and the Boyd myth gnawed at its edges like rot beneath the surface. And the British knew it. Governors and naval officers invoked the massacre in official correspondence, always with the same moral sting. We must civilize them, lest the Boyd be repeated. The story became a leash, invisible yet unbreakable. Even when the Union Jack was not yet planted in the soil, the shadow of the Boyd ensured Maori negotiation happened on British terms. It was a slow suffocation, no cannons, no armies, just a narrative loop so powerful it reshaped the battlefield of the mind. Think of it, one ship, one act of vengeance, echoed so loudly it bent the destiny of an entire people. That is the true cruelty of propaganda. It does not simply record history, it rewrites it into a weapon. And in that rewriting, the defeated live forever under the shadow of their own survival. By 1840, the Boyd Massacre had become more than a cautionary tale. It was now a cornerstone of imperial logic. When Britain prepared to annex New Zealand, the story returns in full force, this time inscribed into the rhetoric that justified the Treaty of Waitangi. Officials painted the treaty not as a conquest, but as a safeguard, a way to prevent another Boyd. The narrative was simple, almost elegant. The Maori were too violent to govern themselves, yet too valuable to be left alone. The empire, cloaked in paternalism, must step in. In parliamentary debates and naval memoranda, the Boyd was invoked like scripture. British statesmen recited it as though it proved the moral necessity of annexation. They did not speak of Captain Thompson's lash, or of Te Ara's manor stripped before strangers, or of the sacred weight of Utu. Instead, they spoke of Europeans butchered, cannibal feasts, lawless tribes. Each retelling erased the Maori version of the story, leaving only Britain's carefully curated myth. Savagery in need of salvation. The Treaty of Waitangi, then, was not born from goodwill. It was born from fear, a fear Britain itself had manufactured. To the Maori, the treaty was presented as a pact of friendship, a recognition of Rangatiratanga, the authority of the chiefs. But to the Crown it was something else entirely, a tool to legitimize control, a veil of legality draped over conquest. Behind every signature lay the echo of Whangaroa Bay, whispering that the alternative was blood. Yet even as Britain wielded the Boyd as proof of Maori violence, the Maori themselves carried their own interpretation into the negotiations. Elders remembered the lash, the humiliation, the sacred duty that had forced their hand decades earlier. To them, the Boyd was not savagery. It was justice. It was a reminder that mana must always be defended, no matter the cost. And so, some chiefs signed the treaty with caution, hoping to protect their people from another cycle of Utu. Others hesitated, sensing that the empire's promises carried the same weight as its myths, beautiful words hiding chains. Thus the Boyd lived on, written not only in sermons and newspapers, but in the very ink of the treaty. It had become more than a memory. It was a psychological weapon embedded into the foundation of New Zealand's colonization. A single act of vengeance, twisted into a story, then twisted further into law. And with it, Britain secured not just land, but the moral high ground it had built out of lies. The Boyd never sank to the bottom of Whangaroa Bay. Its wreckage rotted, yes, but the story floated, drifting across oceans carried by newspapers, sermons, textbooks, and eventually classrooms. By the late 19th century, generations who had never seen the bay, never smelled the smoke of that burning ship, believed they knew the truth of it. Children in Britain were taught of the savage cannibals of New Zealand. Settlers in Auckland retold the story as a justification for their own expansion, as though the blood spilled decades earlier had sanctified their claim to the land. The Boyd became not just history, it became identity, a myth etched into the foundation of colonial order. And myths, once cemented, are harder to erase than stone. Even as historians later uncovered the missing pieces, the lash that started it all, the sacred weight of Utu, the arrogance of Captain Thompson, the dominant version endured. The Boyd was memorialized not as a story of cause and consequence, but as a parable of savagery. It entered encyclopedias, it lingered in court arguments, it was whispered in the justifications of settlers who seized land. A single night of vengeance had been refashioned into a permanent scar, a wound kept open for political use. For the Maori, the memory lived differently. Among their descendants, the Boyd was not shame but duty fulfilled, justice carried out for an insult that could not be borne. Elders told the story not to frighten but to remind. Mana must be defended, even when the world turns its eyes in judgment. Yet even here the British version of the tale cast its shard. Tao. To defend the Boyd was to risk confirming the stereotype the Empire had weaponized. To remain silent was to surrender the narrative entirely. It was a cruel trap, an act of resistance forever used as proof of barbarity. And so the Boyd lingers even now. It is cited in academic debates, in novels, in documentaries. It is remembered differently depending on who speaks. To Empire, it remains a justification. To descendants, it is Utu. To history, it is a case study in how violence becomes myth, and how myth becomes control. The disturbing truth is this. The Boyd was never just a ship. It was a mirror. In it, we see the machinery of Empire, how it feeds on stories, how it shapes them into weapons sharper than steel. And as long as those myths endure, the shadow of the Boyd still sails, not across oceans but across minds.